Okay, so the pop-up as message has arrived to say this Hangout on Air is live. So it only serves for me to say welcome, good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good God, what are you doing up at this hour? Whichever of those greetings best fit you, welcome. And welcome to the final in a series of Hangouts that we've been hosting here at HT2 over the past 4 weeks around xAPI, the Experience API. They form part of a MOOC that we've been running entitled Learn xAPI, and for this final particular Hangout, we're going to be joined by Aaron Silvers. I'm going to hang around in the background here for anybody that's got any technical issues, just because I'm the only person that I guess can handle them. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ben Betts, the CEO of HT2, for him to be able to introduce Aaron and get things moving along. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for using my full title. Dr. CEO, as Aaron will well know, is the only way I like to be introduced anywhere. So it's nice once to get that respect. I get literally no respect on these Hangouts at all. So thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching us live on YouTube or if you're watching the recording back, welcome. Today, as Craig mentioned, is the last of our series of 4 Hangouts, our 4 weekly Hangouts as part of the Learn xAPI MOOC. And we're joined by our good friend and colleague, Aaron Silvers. Morning, Aaron.
Good morning. How are you?
Well, I've got tea, and we're celebrating whether or not we have a country or not as we vote to Brexit. Here you go, genuine polling cards.
Wow.
For that privilege. So
that is something that I've never seen before.
I know, it's almost like you don't live in a democracy. I'm not sure it's just me. I've got a big black screen instead of Aaron. I've got a big black screen instead of Aaron at the moment. Anybody else got a big black screen instead of Aaron, or is it just me? Big black screen.
Do you want me to try to reload?
Yeah, maybe. Just give it a literal.
I'm pretty sure it's frozen because his profile picture's not changing at all either. So.
All right. Well, look, I'll intro him whilst he's not here, and then he can't stop me for saying something wrong. So Aaron was one of the original founders and writers of the xAPI specification, and since that time he's been spending the last 3 or 4 years, probably longer, of his life evangelizing, talking to people, understanding use cases, understanding the issues and the adoption issues going forward. And now he's on the verge of well, he already has founded something new in the data interoperability standards consortium to help drive forward xAPI-like things into the future. So Aaron, welcome. I see you. Life is good. I don't hear you anymore. Or now I hear you. Or do I not?
No, you should hear me. Right?
I do hear you. Life is good. Life is so sweet.
Life is sweet.
I've introduced you for yourself, but anything else you want to say about your past history?
There are so many things I can say about my past history, but no, that all sounds quite lovely. You make me sound like someone who's done stuff, so that's cool.
Quite lovely, quite lovely. Well, glad to have you with us. We're going to go for, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes, and if we get more questions, then we'll go a bit longer. So, guys, if you are watching online, then you can ask comments in Curator in the chat box, or you can come join us in the Hangout and ask questions here, and we'll answer them as we go. But I've got a bunch of stuff lined up for Aaron that I want to talk about first, because, hey, I get to host the damn thing, so I get to answer my questions first. I guess the MOOC has been very successful. We split it into this strategy track and this technical track, and both of them have been well received. And both of them are kind of converging in week 3 and in week 4 of the MOOC. People have got to grips with the should we call it the syntactic nature of xAPI, that this is a specification that's telling us how we could form statements and other API-like calls to do it in a standards-like way. But what people are starting to get to grips with now is that it's not enough. Is that actually the xAPI alone is not enough to start doing things, and we need to really be thinking about the semantics of stuff and the words we're going to use and the definitions and recipes and profiles and controlled vocabulary and all that stuff. So I mean, I guess my first question to you then, Aaron, is around that, because obviously, as you were coming up, and I realized it was a big team effort, it wasn't just you, but as these guys as this committee is coming together to form what xAPI version 1.0 should be, What's the pressure like around the idea of having a very top-down controlled vocabulary to say, look, these are the words that you're just going to use, and this is what you're going to use it, versus what we've ended up with, which is this, it's very open, lots of possibilities, but also maybe lots of opportunities for things to go wrong. So what was the pressure like at the time?
Well, I think the pressures were very much, representative of what they are now, with the exception of that now we have implementations which, spur their own kind of attention and speed and necessity. So just to kind of recap that, it seems like yesterday, but it is like probably 4 years ago. It is literally 4 years ago. It's 2012. We were at MLearnCon in San Jose, California. We launched really the base of the Tin Can API, the 0.9 version of the spec. It's the first thing we actually released as an actual working API. And it included a fixed vocabulary in there, arbitrarily, derived from the vocabulary that was in Swarm. And that made a lot of sense. We needed to have something in place that was fairly solid, that if we were going to have people model it and work with it, even at a prototype phase, there had to be something that we could pretty much count on everybody would do it the same. So having a fixed vocabulary made things really, really easy. There's no question about it. Like, we went from really a draft of what became 0.9 to 0.9 between like December of 2011 and basically March of 2012. Okay. And from around March of 2012 to June is when you started seeing, 14 different implementations from 14 different vendors that all work the same. So that was pretty significant. What we realized as this was happening was, the argument for having a fixed vocabulary inside the spec was great. I think I and certainly others started to question, like, who are we to define the vocabulary that everybody should use by default? And even if you create extension mechanisms that may allow you to even overwrite those vocabulary words, or you're still kind of like stacking the deck for how xAPI is going to always be used by including this fixed vocabulary in it. And I'm not going to lie, we looked at we went philosophical and looked at like Korbzinski and general semantics, and it was just like, it's our language that frames our understanding of what things can do, and also frames our constraints. And so we pushed very strongly, some of us more than others, but I think we won the argument, that we needed to have another way to deal with vocabularies being defined by communities of practice, and a way to map those different definitions together so that you could have ontological crosswalks so that the data could be understood in whatever domain it was in, assuming that humans, pass through multiple domains, where there are multiple contexts and multiple understandings of what a word might mean, like the word fired. So we didn't have an answer for how that was going to have to work. We knew it had to be kind of a community-defined process, and we trusted that the technology would serve the technologies. If they weren't already created, would present themselves the opportunity for us to define. And lo and behold, we're starting to see technical approaches to doing that. To being able to link this data from one domain to another.
And so, I mean, when you were thinking about that sort of, when you're still in that 0.9 phase of, look, we've defined a bit of stuff there. Was it on your mind that if you are going to go for a top-down approach, then someone's going to have to manage this for the entire life of this project? And I don't know enough about ADL to say this with any certainty, but that's kind of not what ADL does, and we can give a bit of history about what it is they do. But in terms of managing that for the rest of eternity, was that ever on the cards?
No, not. Let's put it this way. that intent was never there. So one of the things that with SCORM is that ADL vis-a-vis the U.S. Department of Defense, and it ends up with the maintenance and upkeep of SCORM. And if that's going to continue to be used or added to or changed in any way, like that's on them to do. The challenge with SCORM is that it was so, like SCORM 1.2 was so entrenched and adopted, and all the engineering and investment that went into SCORM 2004, they didn't exactly get a return on that, because the long tail adoption, there was so much SCORM 1.2 adoption by the time that they were able to improve it, that no one was going to pick up on the improvements because the pain of upgrading wasn't worth to a lot of vendors and stakeholders the value that they were already receiving from 1.2. ADL, I think, and DoD, I think, wisely realized that they are really good at inspiring and influencing and framing, applied research and development that could turn into standards, that could turn into specifications, that could turn into baseline technologies. And from a development effort, like they're really good at building out, very targeted applications or testing, harnesses for, these different specifications. It's what ADL has been really good at. I think a challenge came for us in terms of like, what are we going to do with xAPI? In terms of how does that proceed? And I think they wisely chose that they looked at it from the very beginning as, we're going to do research and development on this spec. What we're not going to do is try and run it forever and ever. That it needs to go somewhere, and it needs to be open enough that different audiences will find use out of it rather than just a learning technology thing.
So, I mean, that's quite interesting. You just sort of touched on the word open there, and that's a bit of a difference between this and previous things. This is open source. This is there. I can go and fork xAPI if I so chose, and do whatever I want. And was that always the case from the beginning, or was there ever any contention around that, or? No,
that so the team went in with the idea that this has to be open source, and we looked at there's a couple different reasons, and I'll touch on them. But let me first sum up and just give you the greater points. That we were very pleased that DoD and ADL were so embracing of open source at the time that we did it, and they did it, and I think they did it for the reasons that I'll outline here. One is when you consider SCORM. All right, and the development of that, and when it took the resources that it took to make that, it took millions of dollars a year of investment from the government, and it took about a team of about 30 to 40 engineers full time to prototype, to spec it, etc. While you had a lot of stakeholders who were coming in from industry, but it wasn't exactly an open source process. And in fairness, in the mid '90s, that the idea of open source was not quite as ubiquitous or even documented as it was for us when we wanted to do this in the mid 2000s. 10 years makes a huge difference in how one does open source. So we had lessons that we could learn from when we started out. We also had models to look at. We looked at I looked primarily at what John O'Bacon did from a community management side with the Ubuntu distribution for Linux. He wrote a book on community management for the Art of Community. It's an O'Reilly book, and he was like, "This is what it means to be a community manager for. This is how you run an open source project as a community manager." And I was like, that was really like, in many ways, like at least a primer, if you will, on how to even approach challenges like this. And we looked at other models of facilitation and things like that, and we also looked at what other groups were doing, and looking at things that they were doing that we didn't like or thought might be mistakes or might be things that just didn't fit with our goals, and work to just not do those things, and then everything else we just accepted was we were going to learn on the job. But yeah, the open source thing, it was a huge cost. It made for cost savings because now you only have like 4 or 5 full-time dedicated resources instead of 40 in order to do this. And that means that the bulk of this is going to be done by people outside of your organization. Well, that requires parameters, it requires conditions where people can earn trust, where community can truly develop and emerge on its own and just be kind of shepherded along. So that, it wasn't a top-down process at that point. Now it's like, well, we have people volunteering their time and effort in order to make something collectively that all of us can use. It has to meet all of our needs. Well, articulating what those needs actually are and surfacing them and encouraging people to not gripe about things and just be passive-aggressive, but also to identify a problem and state how what you did to try and fix it.
I think that's a really good point, and it's one that I get a bit exercised about this on occasions because xAPI is agnostic. It's a spec. Like it, love it, whatever. Yeah. But when I hear criticisms of, I'm not sure it's a thing or this isn't going to do it. Today I got an email from Elliot Maisy as part of his Learning 2016 shout out. These are the key topics that they're going to cover. I'm going to be there. Elliot, I know well, and we've worked together many times. But his little bit on xAPI makes his top trends, and it's xAPI : will it last? And I'm kind of like, well, I'm not sure what people think in terms of some. Like, I appreciate that it originated from, a Department of Defense initiative and some other things going for it. But it's kind of that, you mentioned that sort of routine. Is it that people just gripe about they're going to do something? This is fundamentally a community effort at this point. And so it's kind of, it's a bit self-defeating, like we're waiting for some big entity to deliver the perfect thing to the world. And actually it's folks who are spending huge amounts of their time unpaid and without much recognition doing a lot of stuff. I mean, everyone's got some game in the end that they're going to get paid one day or that something's going to pay off or that something's going to work there. But overwhelmingly, I mean, this is an unfair question to ask of you, but, in terms of that community / that people's time got paid for out of government money routine, over the last 2-3 years, how has that balance swung from going through the versions to where we are today? Are people actually just getting paid to work on this thing, or is this now 100% sort of community-driven effort? I don't even know where we are right now.
Well, I mean, I would argue that I get paid to do this thing, but that's also my business. That's not an ADL thing. I'm no longer on ADL salary. I haven't been in 2.5 years, right? I'm now. And Megan Bowe as well. We are completely independent, and this is if that doesn't start to be the makings of an industry where you have shops that are dedicated to just doing stuff with xAPI, right? That they're actually able to survive and make a living doing it. How is that not an industry? And now you can argue, how does that scale? Well, there are a few key pieces that need to be in place for it to scale. For those opportunities to scale, and it so happens that those are the activities that we've been working on to take on. That's why we have the Data Interoperability Standards Consortium. So we even upon my exit of ADL in early 2014, somebody had to start looking around to other organizations to be like, to the earlier point, ADL doesn't want to be owning this forever. The goal for it is to eventually make its way to standardization. So we started doing, I was charged by the vendor community, by the community of people who are contributing to the spec, by folks at ADL, and encouraged to work with IEEE on seeking out what were the possibilities of where we could take the spec if we wanted to do standardization. And we pursued that, and it became pretty clear, really by late summer of 2014, that one, it wasn't really ready for standardization, but two, it was much bigger than something that, it was already becoming an industry, the basis of an industry. In terms of you have businesses now that are committing their whole selves to working with xAPI. You actually have customers, larger organizations that are actually now putting serious investments in technologies that make use of xAPI. Like, there are people who are trying to grapple with what are the best practices for designing learning experiences and performance experiences, and like how do we get the data that we want? How do we make the improvements that we want? There were a lot of things needed to start to come together and formalize, or at least have a group that could apply resources to do it. And so from, we look for other organizations to take that on, and at the end of the day, we realize that this community really needs its own organization, because it is such a community. It is so really, I would say, co-owned by the participants in the spec calls and the people who are helping to contribute to the spec and people who are writing software based on it, that it really needs an organization that represents their needs, as opposed to trying to fit into something like IEEE just yet. And so, yeah, that's happening, and that's what the Data Interoperability Standards Consortium is about. That's why we formed it, and that's why we're taking on things over the next 4 years, like conformance testing, like software certification, LRS product certification, professional certification programs and bodies of knowledge that are official, so that we talk about what it means to design, a learning, something that creates xAPI data. What's involved with that? What are the things what are core things you need to know? What's the code of ethics with which you need to abide by in tacitly doing this? Where's that divide of what do we track too much? Are we tracking enough? Are we getting the data that we need? Are we getting the value out of it that we need? Same thing with developing, the same thing with analyzing, the same thing with managing projects. It's like there's a huge. There's clearly, as you know, Ben, and I think everybody else on this, who's on the Hangout probably knows, although I don't know Hangout very well. Hi, there's so much that goes into conceiving of a project like this, because xAPI is so flexible and it is so right now open-ended. There's a lot of things to consider, especially when you start dealing with integration. There's a lot of things that you could start with. There are turnkey products that you can use, but to do things that will ultimately drive like the most value in the most critical ways, it's not just about turnkey solutions. It's going to end up being custom integrations that you're going to use xAPI to help you with. And to figure out what those are and to manage those requires a body of knowledge that is, right now distributed and somewhat tacit in places. But it's hard to come up with like one collective, way or place where that stuff exists.
So let me just bring you back and summarize, and then go forward a couple. I've got two big questions, and I'll ask some of the questions that some of the other guys are getting into. So first of all, xAPI, open source, ADL, not going to support it forever. This is very much a community effort. So if people are saying, will it last, or where does it go, or what happens here, then the answer is someone has to make it better. Somebody, this is for the community to take on and do stuff about it, and people have. And then to corral that into some semblance of order and governance, you've come up with the vendors and the people who are already adopting have kind of empowered yourself and others to come up with the data interoperability standards consortium, DISC, which is non-profit organization, going to be custodian of I'm putting words in your mouth, custodian of the spec, custodian of what goes on to a certain extent. There's a couple of key questions that just off the top of my head. One is, one thing that's come up a bunch is, xAPI is a specification, xAPI is a standard, and you've got the disk name's got the damn word standards in it. So just give me the clarity on that one for the moment, for the record. What we've got at the moment is a spec. When we're going to go forward and things like that, is it that you're looking to take what you have there and turn it into a standard, or that there will be standards around the application of the specification, the best practices and things like that? Is it all of the above? What's in your mind?
It's actually a bit of column A and a little bit of column B. So it is a spec right now. The reason why it is, I would say it's not ready for standardization is because we still envision that there are ways in which we may need to change it. It may still change. Those changes may have breaking changes with existing implementations. Maybe they don't. There's a couple different. We just haven't been. We're starting to see, I would say, just how far the stitches actually hold as the seams start pulling. In terms of like what exists with xAPI as it is today. But it may change, and we need to give it a little bit of time to see how that may change, so that as soon as we get to a point where we can see that look, it's not going to change anymore, really, or at least not in any substantial way that's going to break with existing implementations. And then at that point, then it's ready to move on into formal standardization, whether it's IEEE or ISO or OASIS or any number of standards organizations that we can take it to. Like we'll go down that road. In the meantime, we will help to define, and by we will help define, we will enable communities of practice to come together and provide them the means to document things in a way that everybody can follow. The ways in which xAPI might be extended. So a couple of things that really change one's thinking about like whether it's things need to change in the spec versus whether things can be extended or have a profile built on top of xAPI as a derivative work. CMI5, for example, has some very clear functional requirements of the systems that use CMI5. It is built on top of xAPI. It's a profile of it, and it has with it a fixed vocabulary set. That defines for a learning management system the kinds of things that SCORM would have defined. In terms of how a session initializes, how it terminates. Very technical stuff in terms of the operations of the LMS, but that kind of dealing with sessions is something that or trying to make a state out of stateless things that's what CMI5 does. Now, CMI5 is not it is built on top of xAPI, so it does that, but not everybody who uses xAPI has to adopt CMI5, right? There may be 30 use cases that it could be in mass adoption that have no need of what CMI5 offers. But it's there if they need it. Or there's a means for them to build a top of CMI5 for a particular extension as they may need it for their particular purposes. And you know what? That's totally cool too. So for example, one big technical thing that's been talked about a lot is like the use of JSON LD as opposed to JSON, the unstructured JSON that we have right now. And that's a really good discussion, and it's a really good point. Does it require us to adopt that at the core, or can we build a profile of xAPI that says, if you're going to do JSON, and you're going to build LRSs that make use of JSON LD data, all right, here's how you do it, and make it a profile, and make it optional, so that you can still work with the core spec as it is, but you could also do this on top of it, and you can now use JSON LD. And oh, by the way, anybody who wants to use JSON LD could do this. And that is a very different approach to thinking about the evolution of standards or specs than we're accustomed to. We're used to having versioning, and like we rev something and everything's got to change. Versus having profiles or extension mechanisms that become almost like a buffet table of things that you can put on the plate as you need them.
And then we can leave some on the side and they just get wasted in the trash because I couldn't eat that much.
Well, but you can do that because if they're not needed,
it's a buffet. I can do whatever the hell I want. You can't stop me.
And there's more there.
There's more there.
There's more there.
Well, so last question from me for a while. Then I'm gonna go into some of the other ones that we're getting in from Curator and in the chat here. Standardization on one hand, and I really like that notion of the extensions and the profiles and how that's going to build across it and give it a bit of time to see that things settle. then bring me to conformance and one of those things. So I mean, I've been reading the DISC website, and you know, conformance, all one page of it. Conformance comes across to me as something that, you know, this looks like something you guys are going to try and tackle.
Yeah. So let's just. I think it's enough to say that this year's a big focus on software conformance, and particularly around LRSs, conformance to the spec. You know, what does it mean for an LRS to follow the spec, you know, correctly, and how do we test for that? What are the requirements around that? And so that's going to be a big focus for this year, because what that enables then is the ability for us to, for a third-party organization like DISC, to be able to certify products and say, you know what? You're from a large company, you're from a government, you're from a large academic institution. You want to buy products that you can just count on knowing that they're going to work with xAPI. Someone's going to define that for you. That's what that means, right? So it's not like one-off and one-off, one-off. That, you know, what it mean when we say this works with xAPI, there's a stamp of approval that says, yep, that's going to work. And anybody who has that stamp of approval, you can count on those products working together. And that organization, that's the kind of effort that DISC is taking on, you know, on top of having conformance testing.
Awesome. So, I look forward to seeing more of that. And if you want to see evidence of how the community does that, you just look at GitHub for Learning Locker's issues list, and you end up with a bunch of people. Questions coming in from around the place. One from Glenn in Curator. He asks, are the big companies like Adobe and Google, etc., pursuing alternatives that will supersede xAPI? Microsoft and Google are doing a lot of work in education. Do you see them adopting xAPI or developing their own standards? So he's talking about Adobe, Google, Microsoft. What are they doing here? What are the risks? What are you seeing in terms of that, or them just going and developing something themselves?
Well, I think it's safe to say that, like, you know, we've already seen that Adobe is doing something that's kind of on their own, and I would say that Google is already using Google Analytics for a lot of the things that, you know, we might think about using xAPI for, you know. And Microsoft, I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I don't know what they're doing internally, but or externally, because I know they have, I think, an LMS product, but they also have, you know, like Google, like Adobe, they have learning management systems and all sorts of learning systems inside their organizations themselves. My guess is, and it's somewhat based on, you know, maybe ancillary conversations I've had with at least, you know, some of the names on this list, and the folks at Autodesk and the folks at Amazon who've kind of opened up, you know, to, you know, talking about a little bit about what their plans are and what they want to do. I think that everybody starts by doing their own thing, especially when you're a technology company. And eventually, when you start realizing that you want to maybe plug and play with the existing products and tools that are off the shelf, they start looking for the standards that help them do that. And then they're going to look at xAPI to do that. You know, and depending on their use case, they might look at something like IMS Caliper. You know, it really depends on what domain we're talking about and what the contextual application is. But xAPI is a pretty, you know, for all the reasons that make it somewhat painful in terms of the fact that there isn't an embedded vocabulary, it is very generic. And it allows for a lot of different systems to basically just be able to pass data to and from. So there's a pretty well documented way in which there's an endpoint that data is supposed to go to. There's a way in which that data is supposed to be structured and understood. You know, there are communities of practice that define vocabularies for it. Like, these are not people are doing that right now.
I think it's a fair point. I mean, they are just the biggest adopters of open source libraries and things like that. All of the big technology companies are the authors, the adopters, the promoters, and things like that of just the biggest thing. So if you look at any open source conference or anything like that, there will be tens of people from these sorts of companies rocking up and showing off what they do with these sorts of things. So it seems, you know, to Glenn's question, in my eyes, it seems likely folks will probably already be doing stuff, or if they're not already doing stuff, they're probably aware of it and they have a very specific reason for doing something elsewhere. These guys will not get further faster by reinventing something they could just contribute to, and they would contribute to things they have. contributed to tens of hundreds of things that are out there. So I'm not sure that it's I think it's more likely they'll be promoting and doing more than anything else. And if they're doing something that's similar but very different, then there are some questions there for us in terms of, okay, well, what could we learn? Why? Where's that gone to? You mentioned Caliper for a second there, which I was going to come on to anyway. That's come up a bit in week 3 of our MOOC in terms of Caliper as a spec, as a thing. And I know we had some recent conversations around that. What's the sort of movement there? I mean, people in the MOOC were by and large thinking, hey, look, this looks really similar. It doesn't really look like there'd be many big issues. If we wanted to make these two things work together, they're so darn close that actually this probably isn't an issue.
So it's really hard for me to tell you much about what's going on with Caliper and xAPI working together. I mean, I hear about current adopters of Caliper who really want an integration with xAPI, and I probably hear about it from them more than I hear about folks who aren't using Caliper wanting to start making xAPI work with Caliper. And that's just probably that's a product of the people that I talk with, not necessarily like a completely demographically unbiased polling of like the needs for it. I want people to be able to use both, and I don't particularly care who makes that happen. I think that there are some, for whatever reasons, and I guess some reasons why Megan and I have been uninvited from wanting to participate and from being able to participate directly in that process from an IMS perspective. But the reality is, like, as long as it happens, and I believe it can happen, and I think that it looks to me from what I've seen, what little I've seen, that there are efforts already underway from within IMS to have it work with xAPI, and that's great, fantastic. If they do it, great. If they don't want to do it, and individuals want to step out and from their community or their adopters to make it work with them, I think you'll see. I think you've seen from the hackathon where we had the Edinburgh statement that there's a pretty large local community, that has adopted xAPI in some way or another. And they're more than willing to pitch in and help make that work. It's not our spec in terms of when I talk about Caliper. So IMS completely governs that process and the ownership and how even if they want, it's not even necessarily making a change to their spec. It might be a profile or an extension. I don't know. But that's for them that's for that group to figure out. All I can say is that from our side and from a DISC perspective, and I think from the entire xAPI community perspective, if anybody wanted help, they wouldn't even have to ask. We and I think the other people in the community would just make it happen. We'd find the resources to make it happen.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'd agree as well. So, slight segue there. Question from Jim. Do you see that government intervention could halt development before it gets beyond their influence? I mean, of ADL, is there any risk here in going down xAPI type routes and then ADL either pulling it or pulling funding or pulling something from it? Is that a risk anymore, or is that not a thing?
I mean, let's put it this way. I think it really depends on how you want to define risk, and really probably comes into risk tolerance, right? I don't see the xAPI needs, funding from any government entity in order to do that, in order for xAPI to grow or continue. What it would benefit from are, I would say, some kind of recognizable, endorsements or statements, and that can come in, pronouncements, and that can come in also RFPs, in terms of like, if you're going to buy technologies, learning technologies, performance technologies, and they have to use xAPI, and you say that they have to use xAPI, well, that's going to create a market driver for xAPI, and that's honestly the only true driver you're going to have for the, how credible is xAPI for the long haul. Now compare that to any other approach right now for doing this type of thing in terms of moving data around in an interoperable way. What are the other options? And how close are they to even having RFPs made about them? And so, like, that's the kind of thing we're on, where not to be almost the opposite of open source, but the very business pragmatist, it's like, if there's if people, if government, if industry, if organizations, healthcare institutions, etc., if they find value in xAPI and they start requiring it in terms of their technology adoption, that's how you know it's going to last. And that's really the only marker of investment that one should have in xAPI. Will xAPI be superseded someday? Probably. We've tried to create something that wouldn't be like Storm, that would be an impossible feat for something better to come along and take it over. Ideally, that evolution happens with the cooperation of the xAPI community, such that those transitions are graceful. And along with that, then you have an embedded market base for those things to happen. Whereas we had basically had to start from scratch, more or less, in terms of because what we're doing is so radically different from the space that we occupied before, which was SCORM. Yeah.
Cool. So, people. Hi, people. I want to hand it over to anybody else who's in the Hangout at the minute. We've got about 15 minutes left. So if anybody who's joined us in the Hangout wishes to ask Aaron a question or anything like that, just go ahead, unmute yourself, and go ahead and ask.
I don't want to jump on the whole thing, but I was at the JISC Learning Analytics Network meeting yesterday, and it was great to see the progress they're making. And to actually see a student interface, the kind of end result of it, and to see the learning record warehouse in action, that was awesome. When you came over for the xAPI camp, you said that the work that JISC was doing was one of the big shifts that you saw. Are you still feeling that there's momentum growing? Those kind of the big adoptions, the move from use cases to case studies, is that something you're seeing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the most radical things that are happening right now are with xAPI in organizations that are actually implementing it are unseen because they're still in the building. And in some cases with organizations, they don't want to share too much about what they're doing until they've reaped some benefits from it, where they're risked for, in terms of competitive advantage. Until their risks, can be, somewhat softened a bit. But yeah, I think, as you're already seeing with JISC, and I love what JISC is doing for many reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that it is open and it is very transparent about what they're doing, so we can see in kind of real time what the progress is. But only in hindsight can we appreciate the impact, right? So I think, November of this year, there's a DevLearn, there's a big conference, where I think people around this industry gather together, and they tell stories about what's been happening. And I think that even the learning interface that you saw yesterday, the impact of that in implementation will be better felt and understood 2 or 3 months from now. And then you have data to illustrate what that story really means and what that impact really is, and that provides you at least a benchmark or a milestone that you can compare, that you can benchmark against later. And then you have we're getting to a point now where, even consider this MOOC as another milestone that you could set against the benchmark of the last one that we did about a year ago, right? What's been the growth like? What's been the maturity of the conversations about it? What have been how many more resources are there available to people, to make use of? How many of them are different from the resources that were pulled together, for the first MOOC? There are, we're able to. I think one of the things I love about xAPI as a community, as a community endeavor, as opposed to just being a spec, is the fact that we are kind of dog fooding it. We are eating our own dog food, if not by the use of xAPI, but then at least in the practice of how we would use it. And it gives us data to actually make better decisions about like how we're evolving. So to your bigger question, yeah, I don't think that anybody can really stop it at this point. I think it can only just kind of grow as it does. Now, is that going to meet the needs of people who want very simple answers and want they like hegemonies? No, it's not. We're not out to win it all, but we might win it all. But that's not really the intent,
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Aaron. I've put a link out in the Hangout, and we'll put it in the comments of the of Curator as well, if anybody's interested. The guys talking about the JISC Effective Learning Analytics project in the UK, which is a UK public-funded initiative that uses the xAPI amongst other technologies. But this is a £1 million plus being put into developing an open analytics architecture based off xAPI and being developed over the course of a few years. So they're having big influence here in the UK and in the wider world as they look to do something at a national or international level around xAPI. And it's kind of facetious as a point to make, isn't it? But what happens if one of the reasons that people don't put out case studies about what they're doing with xAPI is because it's so damn effective that they don't want to. I guess that's a bit of a facetious argument, but there's always a danger of waiting for that, and there is a lag. There is just this massive lag between thinking about implementing it, actually implementing it, getting it right. I don't know if you sympathise with this point, Aaron, but one of the things I have with especially when you talk about analytics and things like that is, and Janet, who's on this Hangout, will sympathise with me. Fundamentally, if we're going to use xAPI type data to do analytics, then what we're going to find out is a whole bunch of ways in which things don't work. And people generally don't want to talk about that. They don't want to generally put out a case study of, look, here's 50 new ways in which e-learning doesn't work. But that's actually a huge leap forward for us and something we haven't done in 25 years. So it's very difficult. This isn't what people sit down to do. I'm going to do some science today, and guess what? I found a breakthrough. Well, it doesn't really work like that. It's finding 150 ways that it doesn't work that's actually interesting. So there's we almost need the anti-case study coming into play and being worthwhile of promoting, but of course it's not. People don't really go in for that very much. That would be research.
Well, I think people tend to avoid the negative, what they consider negative stories, whereas I would say the way I would look at that is like, okay, so now we have a lot of evidence about things that we shouldn't do. So let's not do that. And that means anything else we do is going to be different, that might be different than repeating things that we already know don't work.
I just think that's huge, though. This is like a huge. We're looking for this repository of best practices, what you should do, but we don't have this repository of what the hell you should not ever do. And it's kind of like those routines where I'm like, this is a need. I don't know. Maybe I'll campaign for the disc to have a little subsection somewhere on a website somewhere. The results of things that you shouldn't do according to xAPI-based data.
The value of the road's not taken.
Yeah, basically. This is where we've got to get towards. But I think that's one of my fundamental frustrations of it is that, we're getting into things, measuring stuff that people never measured. We're getting into being able to understand relationships where they do or do not exist. And I think we'll find that a lot of things we presumed to be true are in fact not. And that does not make for a great case study, or as we say here in the UK, doth butter no parsnips. Any other questions from anybody in the Hangout whilst I go away and butter some parsnips? Well, I'll keep buttering, and if anybody wants to say anything in the Hangout, then just put a text message in, and I'll unmute for that at the time. I want to talk also a bit about the future, because we touched on a bit about the past, about how it came to be, the need for, this is a community-driven effort, huge amounts of people putting in tons of time into it, looking to be driven forward to its next evolution with the data. Oh, for God's sake, Interoperability Standards Commission. I'm just going to call it DISC from now on because I'm not going to be able to do that.
Interoperability is a hard word to say. I love it.
It's kind of ironic that you can't say interoperability. So the that's where we're going to back that. Well, HT2 is certainly backing that as an initiative to help corral and govern some of the efforts that we're going to need around the idea of profiles, around standardization, around conformance. So that's going to be one of the vehicle that we look to back going forwards, and I hope others will join us. I know others will. I hope many join us. But talk to me a bit about the future, and what are the things that people are looking out for over the next 3 to 5 year horizon. We're doing a lot of e-learning-y stuff. We're in SCORM replacement territory in a few places where maybe we shouldn't be, or whatever. But what's big? What's new? Where's it going?
It's tough to say. I think there are. I mean, let's look at this. We've seen prototypes of people doing stuff with Internet of Things. And it's raising. And the nice thing to your point about illustrating the things that you shouldn't do, it's making the awareness of how we need information assurance and cybersecurity measures, and dealing with how we deal with personally identifiable information. That stuff's coming up because it's coming up quick because it is so ambient and it potentially pervasive depending on its how implemented it becomes. So I'm excited about IoT because of the possibilities for formative evaluation and assessment, where now you're in an environment that's smart enough to know what you're doing in context, and be able to at least record it. Not necessarily tell you what to do about it yet, but at least be able to, without you having to self-identify, almost like third-party observation, to augment the ability of a facilitator and evaluator to be well, here's all this other anecdotal data that you didn't see or you couldn't record so fast. But then that allows you to focus on the things that you can, that only you can do. And then here's this other information to help you make a well-formed opinion and assessment of whether somebody is competent or not in practice. So I'm excited about IoT for those reasons. And I'm particularly excited about those applications when it comes to manufacturing labor. I'm excited about where those applications come into place for healthcare in terms of medical education and medical practice. I'm particularly excited about those applications in terms of government and military, in terms of how do we improve the performance of the people who are serving? How do we save more lives? How do we operate better? All of those things. We're going to see some of that kind of come into play even in terms of customer service and sales, where you're just what are the things that we're observing about how people interact with our customers, and what can we do to improve that in soft ways, in quite subtle ways, but are very personalized and tailored for the particular person that we're talking about, not a giant wet blanket that we throw over an entire audience because somebody had bad customer service one time, and it's those types of things, those types of stories that get me excited about what xAPI can really be about.
Awesome. So one more question just coming from Curator, and then we'll move it towards a wrap-up. A question from Carl. Carl asked if we talk a little about the historical and future overlap with W3C work, and in particular he references activity streams, which was a fundamental reference point for some of the original work. There's activity streams 2.0 and other things like that. Where did we come from there? What's the overlap and things like that?
Well, when we were if you can remember back to 2011 or so, where it was a project in Canada. We didn't even have a spec yet, but Rusty Software had done a lot of research, a lot of requirements gathering. They had a user voice forum. We had a lot of things identified based that in terms of requirements about if we were going to do something new, what did it need to do? What did it need to enable? And at the time, Activity Streams 1 was just coming out. And I happen to know Chris Messina, who was part of that group, and so I got a chance to actually talk with him a bit about it. I got a chance to actually see their work as it was coming together, and then get some background with some what they were basing it on with Vygotsky and Yuan. And it seemed to be something that we felt would actually fit a lot of the requirements we were looking at. And we spent, I would say, a good part, a month or two, really working through, like, how can we just use activity stream and not create something on our own, and just do that. One of the issues that we had there was that their vocabulary was fixed, and it was different than the vocabulary from a learning perspective that we would need. And there wasn't a real clear way to extend it at 1.0. And the group that gathered around it was pretty. It wasn't W3. I don't even know that it was W3C at the time for 1.0. It was just its own kind of ad hoc group. And their approach was, at least stated, that, like, look, if anybody really wanted to use this and you had a need, come to them, and they'll consider it. And we came to them with basically the idea of, like, this is great, but we need two things. One, we need to have a way for this data to go somewhere, which 1.0 didn't provide that at all, that mechanism at all, or define it at least. And two, we need a way to have different vocabulary than this, or extend it, And they were just like, well, that's not really what we're about at the time. So that's when we started going down the road of the Tin Can API. After that was out, and people from Activity Stream saw it, and they were like, hey, you know what? That stuff sounds really good. We should do that for 2.0. And that's why you have 2.0. Yeah, that's why you have W3C. And they've done some great things with it. I don't know what the adoption is like for Activity Streams 2.0, because it's not a spec that I actively follow, to be honest with you. But that doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that it's not influential, in a lot of ways too. Everybody's iterating off of somebody else's good work in these fields. So, I'm glad that if Activity Streams 2.0, if they're working on a 3.0 or a 2.5 or whatever it is they're going to do with it, if they do anything with it, if it's of value, great. And if there are opportunities to merge with W3C because the needs present themselves to do so, I'm totally down for that. In much the same way that I'm down for making it work with Caliper. The thing about the spec world today, the standards world today, that is very different from 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, is that you don't need to have one ring to rule them all. All right? Like, as long as these different groups can actually talk to each other, exchange with each other, then it doesn't really matter which of these you use, because in order to play with anybody who's practicing or making use of data from some other approach, there's a way to make it work. And that is honestly far more important and far more scalable than the idea that everybody's going to do the exact same thing.
I think it's a good note to end on as well, there, Aaron, because it's always been I've obviously got a preference for xAPI above things, but I think it's just that the idea of adopting a standard approach to the way in which we deal with data and the way in which we look at interoperability is so core to what we want to do next. And all the things that are sexy and cool around personalization and analytics and just-in-time and performance support and Internet of Things and everything is kind of predicated on us being a bit more deliberate about what we're doing with data and data interoperability. So, another good spec to perhaps follow, be aware of, and see what's going on. Certainly doesn't offer quite the same utility to the learning fraternity as anything else, but I think it should reassure everybody that fundamentally folks from all sorts of walks of life are adopting a very, very similar way to represent experiences, whatever that may be.
Right, and to that point, again, just there's Activity Streams 2.0, there's Caliper, there's probably 20 or 30 other approaches that we don't even know about, all right? And my attitude towards all of them is the same. We will work with everybody. As a community, that should be easy enough to do by profiling, other specs, profiling xAPI for a particular audience, the way that we would for people who want to do learning management systems, or people who want to track video, or whatever. You know, like, you're not going to find me saying, no, we don't want to ever connect with them.
Well, it's a good note to end on. Aaron, thank you for your time. Thank you for watching and contributing, everybody. The recording will be up. I'm going to hand back to my beautiful assistant, Craig. He'll love being called that. And wrap it up. But thank you for your time, Aaron.
Thank you.
So I've been called beautiful by Ben, and he's likened me to Claudia Winkleman in only recent weeks. So there's something going on here. I'm intrigued to find out what.
Yeah, it's a good, you know, you are, I often consider you my Claudia Winkleman, and for those of you that are global in nature, you won't understand that, and you probably never will. In fact, people here in the UK are pretty much struggling with it, so, you know.
For those of you that go to exhibitions and conferences, you know the stands I'm talking about, where they have what I would call stand candy on the stands. Myself and our stand candy.
Yeah, we've not been selling much recently, to be honest. I think we need to maybe improve a little bit.
Connection, perhaps. On that bombshell, can I ask you all to join Aaron, give him a round of applause, express your thank you in the chat panel if you would. Aaron, once again, many, many thanks. I know you've had a significant involvement in both this MOOC, the previous one that we did I wasn't involved in, and also all of the work that you're doing, some behind the scenes and a lot not, thankfully, with the xAPI community. So a huge, huge thanks. And as Ben has just mentioned, the recording for this will be out on YouTube pretty much instantaneously and will be shortly followed by being dropped into the relevant part of Curator in the back end not long after that. So once again, Aaron, Ben, thank you ever so much.
Honestly, Craig, thank you guys for doing this. This is the kinds of things that actually make adoption grow. They help bring, bring knowledge about what it is that we're doing and what as a community to like the masses. So really, thank you.
Thank you, man.
Okay.